All right, welcome to Peeling Syd Barrett. This will be episode 18, and in this episode, I'd like to discuss the song Vegetable Man. Now, I've been thinking for a long time about this song because this song is, in my opinion, I guess you could say the most depressing or darkest song that Mr. Barrett released with the band. He didn't actually release it with the band, they released it in 2016. It was recorded in 67. Perhaps it was determined to be too depressing or perhaps too revelatory to be released at that time, so the band chose not to release it. They released Apples and Oranges and Paintbox instead. And two songs went unreleased for a very long time, Vegetable Man and Scream Thy Last Scream. Now both of those songs were, I guess, available on bootlegs. I had never heard them before until I heard the 2016 versions. And I believe that on BBC they played Scream Thy Last Scream at least once. I don't know if they played Vegetable Man as well. It's a very dark song in many ways, and perhaps it would have revealed aspects of Mr. Barrett's mind at that time of late 67 that would have cleared the water a little bit for people to kind of understand what was going on with Mr. Barrett. Perhaps there was a version of Mr. Barrett that became very, very romanticized. The idea of this slightly schizophrenic or tortured mind through the use of psychedelics. And that kind of narrative drove this story of Mr. Barrett for a very long time. But through the discussion of this song, we're going to find out that he may simply have been extremely dissatisfied with a number of things. And perhaps they decided as a group that they didn't want to release that, either because they didn't like the narrative or they didn't like that discussion, or they simply just didn't like the song. And there's no way really of knowing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to link two versions of the song, an earlier and a later version. The lyrics I don't find to be overly consistent. So I'm not entirely certain that what most people think are the lyrics are actually the lyrics. And I have seen variation in the lyrics as they're presented, and I'm not entirely certain why that is. But if I find a lyrical version, I will include that. And as a note, anyway, just go ahead and check out those two songs. If you're only going to check out one, I'll suggest that you check out the cleaner version of the song, which was contained on the later release. All right, hopefully you had a chance to check out the song and some of the lyrics, and maybe you have those up while we're going to go through the discussion. Before I move on real quick, though, I'd like to run through a correction from the previous episode, episode 17. I mentioned attaching interviews with Norman Smith, Roger Waters, and Nick Mason. I'll do that on this episode. Sorry, I forgot to include those on the last one. We've looked at those before, though. I've included those links in previous episodes. So if you're all up to date, you will have seen all those interviews already anyway. If not, I'll include them here. You can check them out. So let's discuss this song really quick. It's a pretty simple song. It has kind of, again, an odd rhythm. Starts off with some distorted guitar with something like an echo effect. And a very slow, pounding, ascending chord progression, which, again, we've noted as one of the hallmarks of Mr. Barrett is an ascending or descending chord progression. One of the best parts of the song, in my opinion, is Nick Mason's drumming on this song. I actually enjoy his drumming on this song. As a general rule, I don't really notice Nick Mason. But on this song, I think he does a really good job, particularly when they have a break in it, where they go through the whole calling for Vegetable Man or the ha-ha-ha part, and then they jump right back in to another verse, and Nick Mason kind of picks up with drums, and it sounds really good. I have heard a lot of people mention that Nick Mason often is kind of referred to as not really a great drummer or whatever. I've never heard Nick Mason referred to as a great drummer, but perhaps he was always kind of requested to keep things low key and steady for the band to keep pace or to keep timing. And I will just point out that that was kind of his job. So when you have a band like the Doors that don't have a bass guitarist, you have to cover that with someone like Ray Manzarek also playing a lot of bass lines. In Pink Floyd, you had the bassist and the drummer, Waters and Mason, providing very, very steady timing and bass line to whatever things that Rick Wright and Syd Barrett were putting together. And quite often those guys are kind of going off and doing their own thing, and then they can rejoin the steady bass line that's the steady bass and timing that's provided by the drums and bass of Waters. So just wanted to point that out really quick. Now, let's go ahead and look at some of the lyrics and discuss those fairly quickly. As I said, this is a pretty depressing song. I think a lot of people immediately think that perhaps he's referring to himself, and obviously there are reasons to think that. But having thought about it for a while now, I don't know necessarily that that's true. So let's take a look at it. The very first line is that he has yellow shoes and he has the blues. Now, obviously, yellow is happy, and then he has the blues. And I'll just point out that that goes back to our idea of a hidden sorrow. Wearing yellow shoes, of course, is a happy color, and then having the blues is an internal process. So on the inside, sad, on the outside, showing that you're happy. The shoes, of course, tie in with your feet symbolically. They are often representative of walking through life, or the path that you choose to walk, which can be a reference to your lifestyle or your work or many other things. So quite often painters will utilize the visual of a shoe to try to capture the life that a person has chosen to walk. So in that way, he may be saying that he's wearing these yellow shoes, which is like a form of false happiness, but he has the blues. And he walks the street, etc., etc. And he says he has velvet trousers and he feels pink. And right there we have a reference to pink. Again, all these colors, so of course color references. Now, the feeling pink here, there's no one else involved. He's only discussing himself. So this can't be in relation to other people. It appears in this case it's making him feel self-conscious, or perhaps containing an aspect of self-loathing, or perhaps just making him withdraw from other people because he hates the way he looks. He mentions that there's a stink with his pants. He mentions his paisley shirt and looking like a jerk. Of course, a paisley shirt at that time was associated with a psychedelic movement. That look specifically was tied to that movement. In the next line, he rhymes, or he clangs on the hard K or hard C sound of turquoise waistcoat, quite, out of sight. So then he rhymes with quite and sight at the end. And then he mentions his haircut looking bad. And of course, his haircut at that time was what was called a Dylan or Hendrix perm, where, you know, he's got that kind of frizzy hair look. And it was starting to look kind of bad. And if you watched the interview with Dick Clark, you could see that it was kind of starting to look kind of bad. He may have hated that haircut, and it was quite popular at the time, that hairstyle. Maybe he liked it at first, and over time, you know, everybody started copying it. I don't know. But there are reasons, in my opinion, why someone would want to look like Dylan and Hendrix, but obviously, for some reason, he no longer wanted to do that. Now, then he goes into his Vegetable Man, and he does his Where Are You? That whole Where Are You bit, I don't know if it comes from a cartoon or something. It reminds me a little bit of Mighty Mouse and his Here I Come to Save the Day kind of song. Perhaps it's a reference to Superman. I don't know exactly what's going on there. It sounds really familiar to me for some reason, but I can't really place it. And it is comically bad. So perhaps he is kind of facetiously referring to this idea of a superhero that is a vegetable. The superhero that is just, and of course vegetable, as a vegetable man, is someone that just stands there and doesn't do anything, or what exactly he's referring to there. It's not entirely clear, but we'll get into this a little bit more after we go through the lyrics. So let's finish up the lyrics some more. He talks about changing his gear and covering up with the latest cuts, and talks about his socks, and he starts clanging on socks and box, and then he runs through the the kind of soft sound of watch, black face, and all the lot is what you got. And if you see that, then that must be him. That's what he is. Now, this is kind of the point where I have to say that this may be a discussion about the nature of society and social relations. In other words, we're judging each other based on what kind of watches we wear, what kind of haircuts we have, what kind of clothes we wear, etc. He's not necessarily saying that he judges himself this way. He's noting the disconnect between who he is as a person and the way other people view him. This could be, of course, because if you're of the mindset that Mr. Barrett was quite exceptional, that he resented that comparison. It's also quite possible that he's mentioning it simply as a discussion about the general nature of social interaction within modern society. And perhaps we'll get into that in a little bit as well. Now, the next line is deeply personal, and it would back up the idea, of course, that he's talking about himself. This is probably the most depressing line of the whole song. He mentions that he's been looking everywhere for a place for him, but he can't find it. It isn't anywhere. So he talks about vegetable man, and you got to see him if you can, and he ends with that. And there's some kind of giggling and joking going on. I did kind of wonder, this is kind of a happy-go-lucky ha-ha song. I wonder if everybody kind of thought it was a happy-go-lucky ha-ha song, and they didn't really recognize the torment that's kind of tied up into this idea of being deeply unhappy with how you are presented or what people think of you, and trying to locate a place that's satisfactory for you, whether that's with your friends or with your family or in society in general, and not being able to locate yourself in a position that feels comfortable or is satisfactory, which is basically what this song seems to be relaying. So that's pretty much it for the song, the lyrics in general. Now, I will relay that the idea of a vegetable man, of course, may tie in with a few of the things that Mr. Barrett is noted to have been doing, which is standing catatonic or not participating in gigs. He would stand and just kind of stare off, or he would play one note repeatedly. This is relayed by many sources. I'm not going to go through and quote them all because it's quite a few. And I will, of course, tie this idea in that perhaps he's summoning the idea of this Superman that is related to him, that is vegetable man, that's just going to not participate because he wants to avoid confrontation or interaction with people that he doesn't want to interact with or be confronted by. And of course, we've already seen that interaction with the critic that was discussing their music previously. I think it was when we discussed Matilda Mother. So all of those ideas may be tied up in the idea of vegetable man. Now, I will relay a piece of artwork that may tie in with this. I don't know exactly what's going on. There is a photo of Mr. Barrett with what looks like it's either asparagus or green onions. I assume it's green onions tied to his head. And of course, I'll give a link to Pink Floyd doing the song Green Onions, which I believe was originally done by the MGs or something like that. And it's really easy to think that he's just doing Green Onions and they're riffing on that. But I will point out that there is a painting by René Magritte from 1964 called The Son of Man. And in that painting, there is a man in a dress, extremely conservative, proper dress, like a suit and tie with a bowler hat, and he has an apple, a green apple in front of his face. And the man's left arm, which is the right arm from our point of view, the viewer's point of view, is bent backwards, and it doesn't make sense. So there's something very off about this painting that's done deliberately. The artist described how the idea of the painting is to kind of pull you in because people want to see the things that they can't see. But of course, we can't see a person's actual face. And of course, a person's actual face is who they really are. As we are human, we recognize one another by our faces. And of course, with the apple in front of the face, what's being portrayed is perhaps a sweeter version of who we are, or a socially acceptable version of who we are. At any rate, we're not seeing each other through the mask that we're wearing in society. So that is kind of the idea that's being relayed by the artist. Now, interesting kind of a side note, there is another painting of this type, Le Jeu d'Amour, which was bought by Paul McCartney. He owns it, and he used that model of an apple for Apple Records, the company that the Beatles started. So this, and of course, Paul McCartney also came to view some of the Games for May and some other of the shows that the art rock movement had kind of put together, with Pink Floyd playing there, of course, as well. I believe John Lennon also did. So the Beatles were somewhat involved with that movement, or at least aware of it. Now, the final thing that I would kind of want to relay that ties in with this, and this is probably the most important aspect of what I'm going to kind of discuss, is a few things that are tied up in the book Jack Kerouac and the Subterreneans. Now, that book is the most important book potentially to explain what's going on. Before we get into it, though, I'd like to point, I believe his name is Dan Neely, and its title is something like The Worst Jazz Solo of All Time, or something like that. And he discusses this repetitive single note playing that is kind of a joke, but also kind of deliberate and part of the bebop / jazz movement. So he gives a breakdown, kind of the history of playing a single note. And of course, a lot of people have an opinion as to why Mr. Barrett would stand there catatonic, playing one note, staring at people. There are various versions. One is, of course, that it's just kind of a joke, and he's messing with people again. We've already discussed that in the last video. It is possible, of course, that he had some form of a schizophrenic breakdown, or he was utilizing psychedelic drugs at the time, or perhaps both of those together. And the last that I would like to kind of point out as a possibility is that this may have been an artistic idea, and that idea is relayed by Mr. Neely. So he kind of points out the idea of just playing one note. And of course, there is an artist from this time, Thelonious Monk, who was known for kind of banging out whatever he was going to bang on a piano, and at times he would get up and kind of walk around and not play while the rest of the band was playing. So it's not entirely unheard of, and I'm not saying that Mr. Barrett, of course, was thinking about doing those things when he was doing what he was doing, but I will say that it is possible that he was thinking about those things. We know that he enjoyed jazz. He may have enjoyed someone like Thelonious Monk and the bebop musicians, and he may have been looking to include those in a way into what they were doing. And of course, very few people would have understood that at all. So let's get to the book then, by Jack Kerouac, and a few words about this book really quickly. I don't like long books. I don't know why I picked this book to read, but I did. And I saw On the Road, and there are numerous people that point to the beat poets, and particularly Jack Kerouac, as a possible explanation of Syd Barrett, or an influence upon Syd Barrett. They don't really go into a whole lot of really specific details about how or why, and that's what I want to do with this portion of the video. Now, Mr. Rob Chapman, in his book, A Very Irregular Head, does call that out. So does Mr. Palacios. A lot of people call out the possibility that, of course, the beat poets were an influence upon Mr. Barrett. We've already discussed the possibilities of Mr. Ginsberg being an influence on Mr. Barrett, and I would like to suggest that this book, The Subterreneans, may be the most important book that you can read if you want to understand kind of what's going on potentially and Mr. Barrett's head at this time. I have not read On the Road. I like Of Mice and Men. I don't like Grapes of Wrath. I like Hobbit. I don't like Lord of the Rings. In many ways, I feel if an artist has something very specific or enlightened or illuminatory to relay, that it often is pretty short and sweet. And when I see something that's really large and drawn out, then I often feel like it's watered down, or perhaps they haven't clearly set out what it is that they want to say. So for that reason, I decided to read the Subterraneans. And I was astonished at how many correlations I could find, not only to Mr. Barrett's music, but also to his personality. So let's go through this. This is going to take a little while, but hopefully, if you follow along, you will also kind of detect some relations to Mr. Barrett. On page 1, second paragraph, Mr. Kerouac discusses who the Subterraneans are. And the Subterraneans are, of course, a subculture or a counterculture. They're the leaders of that movement in the San Francisco area. They're intelligent and they're not corny. They are very intellectual and intelligent, but they're not pretentious. And although they're pretty quiet, they are very Christ-like. And of course, there's a religious aspect there. We've already discussed the possibility that Mr. Barrett wanted to be understood as a form of religious artist. On page 3, second paragraph, they're hanging out outside of a place called the Mask. And Kerouac, who I believe refers to himself as Leo in this fictionalized novel, discusses that he is crudely malely sexual. Or overtly male, which apparently is not considered to be hip or cool to that movement. On page 7, about halfway down the page, there's a reference to the effeminate way that many of these people speak, and how that is perhaps not overly, how it's somewhat disagreeable, and how, of course, when you hear it in women, it's charming, but when you hear it in a guy, it's a little bit strange. On page 11, there's mention of someone potentially utilizing psychedelics that's sitting or lying down, reading, doing nothing but staring at the ceiling all day long, which is being in a somewhat catatonic state. On page 15, about halfway down, there's a discussion, or about a third of the way down, about Whitman being interested, Walt Whitman, of course, being interested in a form of some form of sexual revolution, and Thoreau being contemplative and anti-materialistic. And of course, Thoreau, who was, I guess you could say, one of the original counter-culturalists, who wrote the idea that the mass majority of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And of course, that very line is utilized later on in, I believe, The Wall. On page 20, about halfway down, is a reference to the steel rails covering the ground of America for the railroads, how that destroyed the Native American culture, and of course replaced it with an industrialized modern Western civilization. On page 22, at the bottom, near the bottom, is a mention of Foggy Dew of the Pacific Coast and A Starry Night. And of course, Foggy Dew is a lyric that is utilized by Mr. Barrett. Or it's a visualization, I guess you could say. On page 27, there's a mention of a guitarist who is plucking at just one string repeatedly and eyeing people out or staring at them and kind of making one of the characters angry and wanting to start a fight. On page 28, there's mention of Mardu, who is the primary love interest of the main character in this story, about a third of the way down the page, staring at everyone with really strange vibrations coming from her eyes and just kind of unnerving people so that they don't want to look back at her. At the bottom of page 29, there's mention of her being very afraid or kind of freaking out that people might be trying to do things to her. It mentions things like inject her or do whatever things to her, while she's just kind of walking around on the street. And that is, of course, a form of paranoia to some degree. About halfway down page 37 is a reference to a lady who is a very attractive woman that's referred to as kind of an LA doll type, a hip type with a short haircut. And of course, Mr. Barrett dated someone that had that look. Near the bottom, about 3/4 of the way down the bottom of page 47, Mardu tells Leo that she doesn't think it's good, that he always wants to live with his mother. And of course, Syd Barrett goes on to live with his mother. Page 51 is a reference to reading Proust. Mardu reads Proust and Don Quixote. Don Quixote is of course an alienating novel about a man out of time who has a separate code to live by. On page 54, about 2/3 of the way down, is a letter from Mardu, and she expresses the idea that soon it'll be winter. Won't it be good to know that winter is coming? And of course, the reference there is that they'll be together and kind of reclining, resting with one another. On page 59, there's a reference to sleeping, dreaming, and staying awake. On page 60, Leo expresses his hope that Mardu will turn out to be the woman that can finally live with him in profound solitude, which is an interesting word choice, out somewhere out in the woods, and they'll live in a cottage of peace out away from everything else. And hopefully you're starting to pick up on quite a few correlations to not only Mr. Barrett and his behavior, but also his lyrics and his song and his demeanor. On page 69 is Leo and Mardu. At the top of the page, they're making madhouse eyes at one another to kind of see if they can frighten people with their round stares. At the bottom of the page, they try kind of a telepathy test. I don't know if they're utilizing psychedelics at that time or not. On page 77, about halfway through, the author mentions that there's no way to put down a subterranean on the floor. There's a reference to putting people down on the floor or on the ground. In other words, bring them down to reality, because they are very strong characters, very idealistic. On page 81, about halfway down, the author wants to try to get rid of Mardu without her being hurt and without her noticing, because I'm assuming because he no longer wants to have the relationship, but also doesn't want to hurt her because he cares about her. On page 84, about 2/3 of the way down, is a mention specifically of Thelonious Monk and going to a concert and seeing him kind of do his act. On page 89, about 3/4 of the way down, is a mention that someone's heart is broken and the window and everything outside of the window is bleak. So they're just kind of looking outside the bleak window and considering how everything is unhappy. The bottom of page 90 is a mention of Mardu wandering on the shores of eternity, and she's pressing down her feet into the pale sand and other things on the beach. There is a specific reference to pressing feet down, which of course is a feeling, a sensation, or an idea that is utilized in later songs. Page 91, about 3/4 of the way down, is a mention of birds getting bleak, and that's a sign that things are about to go bad. And Mr. Barrett utilizes quite a few songs containing birds. At the top of page 102 is the actual letter from Mardu to Leo, and she mentions how great it's going to be that winter is coming, and they'll be with one another, wrapped around one another at home and resting, and people shouldn't be too sad, and everything will be okay because they'll know each other are well. At about 1/3 of the way down, page 103, just before the second paragraph, is a mention that Leo has to go walking because things are about to go bad with Mardu, and he can smell death in the air. And so he goes to a San Francisco rail yard, and he cries at the rail yard. Of course, steel rail, there again is the imagery of the cold world, the cold industrial society. Let's see. Middle of page 105. Leo goes by Mardu's place, but there's no light on in her window, which is bad. And of course, that also is a lyric that we will see is used in a following song during Mr. Barrett's solo career. Page 110. Just the beginning of the second paragraph, they talk, or Mardu talks about the war between men, and that is that men war with one another simply to have a woman as a prize. And on page 111, finally, is Leo's final thoughts, that he can go home because the love is lost, and he will write this book. Or he will put together this piece of art with the feeling, with the memory, with the attempt to totally be immersed in a relationship or love and having lost it. So there's a lot in there, and a lot of it doesn't tie in directly with Vegetable Man. The portions that I really want to relay are specifically staring at people with wild eyes and playing one note in a song over and over again. Those are both here in Jack Kerouac's book, The Subterreneans. There is a lot of other information in here that relates to Mr. Barrett and or relates to his lyrics and his songs later. Perhaps he's simply using it as inspiration and pulling from it in a detached form. Perhaps more disturbingly, he may be actually attempting to live this life, which is directed by another person. And of course, as we mentioned before, he wouldn't be the first person to do that. I do recall the first time I heard Sting's song, "If you love someone, you should set them free." And so at that time I was relatively young, and I thought, well, then, that means that you should just let people go if you really care about them. And I guess they'll come back if they want to. But that's a fairly naive way of viewing things in the world, in my opinion now, looking back on life, The idea that you're not going to kind of say what you want and do what you want and let people know where you stand. And of course, if they want to come with you, you should, encourage them to do so. But if not, then yes, let them go then. But the idea that you would just assume that you can't even talk about those things and just let people go and they'll return to you is a detached form of naivete, I would say. So that's a lot of information. And if you haven't had a chance yet to, I will say, if you haven't had a chance to kind of consider this, I will suggest that you do read the book. It's one of my favorite books now, Jack Kerouac, The Subterreneans. And I'll give some information about the book. That's pretty much it. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't subscribed, I'll suggest that you go ahead and subscribe, and perhaps share the video and give a like for the algorithm. Share with other people that you think might be interested in these topics. And if you want to post comments or ask questions, please do. If I make mistakes, please feel free to point them out. I'm not going to get overly upset, if somebody points out something that they think may be a mistake, or perhaps they have another take on it. I think the process of discussion is well worth the time and effort that is required to put into thinking about these things. So hopefully this gives a little bit more insight into the nature of Mr. Barrett. And I can't say, of course, that I know what was going on in his mind at this time, but as we stated, there are only so many possibilities that were going on with him at that time. Either he wanted out and he found a way to get out of the band. Of course, he was under contract, so he would have had to fulfill the demands of his contract to some degree. This has happened with a number of artists, and quite a few times they've got in with disreputable companies. And I'm not saying that's what happened here, but I'm certain that he was under contract to put out music or to support music to some degree. So I really doubt they would have just let him walk, which may be why he came out with 2 solo albums. And who knows, perhaps he was required to help out with some other music. It's hard to say why someone would just let him out of a contract. It is possible, of course, that he simply had a form of a psychotic break or a schizophrenic break, and so he needed to take time out. Perhaps, as we mentioned in a previous episode, he had a broken heart and he needed to move on. Perhaps that was his hope, was that he could tie together his life and heal and then figure out a new way through the world. I do want to mention one thing, which is I think it's a good lesson for a lot of people, and part of the reason why I'm doing this on Mr. Barrett, and that is that it's obvious to me that he felt alienated from people in general or from society. Perhaps he didn't want to participate, but he found a way to make it work for him, which was very different perhaps than what other people would want. But just the idea that a person can have an idealized form of or a concept of who they want to be and how they want to live life, and they can work towards it, and there is suffering involved and there's going to be some pain, but it is achievable. There is a compromise that can be reached, perhaps, between what a person that is in that position, and a lot of people feel alienated from society or from family or from groups of friends, and they're trying to work out how much of it is a give and how much of it is a take. How can you consistently interact with society when you feel it's taking more from you than it's giving to you? That's a question a lot of people have to ask, and they ask it quite frequently. Some people think about it a lot more than others, and some people it impacts their life more than others. But here's someone who was apparently profoundly, in my opinion, profoundly impacted by their relationship with other people and with society, and for whatever reason decided to withdraw, and eventually found peace with that decision, hopefully, and was able to live a kind of a life that was comfortable and happy for them. So, in a way, that's a very positive thing. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I'll check back in with you folks later.